Hey everybody, Michael the Librarian of Magic here, finding and cataloging the magical and pointing you to it. Alright, friends and Star Wars fans, I am here to talk about episode 4 of The Mandalorian, finally, entitled Sanctuary, which premiered on Disney Plus on the 29th of November. It's been a few days since then, but with a holiday and everything, it took me a little bit to watch it and jot down my thoughts about it, but I've got them here in my trusty notebook, and I will let you know what I think. As always, these are very spoilery videos and discussions, and I will proceed with that knowledge. Okay, so this episode, as I said before, was entitled Sanctuary. It was directed by Bryce Dallas Howard, who is a great actress. I've been a fan of her work, and she's obviously the daughter of Ron Howard, the famous director and actor. So it was interesting to see her have a take on an episode. I feel like from some of the articles that I've read on this particular episode, her directing style has been criticized a little bit more than some of the other directors, at least from what I've read. I think this is probably the weakest of the episodes so far, but I don't necessarily think it was because the directing was all that weak. I think that, well, I'll get into why I think that. But what happens is, after the fallout from the last episode where the Mandalorian has to leave whatever planet he was on and all the other Mandalorians come to his rescue, he and the yodeling, the child, take off, and they are trying to look for a place where they can lay low. And they land on this sort of woodsy little rural backwater planet called Sorgan. And I don't know why they gave this planet a name and they didn't give any of the other planets in the series so far a name, but they did, so this planet is called Sorgan. And the very beginning of the episode, actually, before the Mandalorian lands there, shows this little village, little rural village on this planet where these people farm krill, which are like little aquatic creatures, just like similar to Earth, little prawn-like things, and they sort of dig these big ponds, and then they like farm them out of there, and they have to seed these little ponds. Anyway, their village gets invaded by these Klatooinians, who are sort of like raiders that just sort of trash their village and burn it. And there's a woman that's shown with her daughter, and they hide underneath a basket in one of the ponds, and they save themselves from being, killed or raided by these Klatooinians. Klatooinians, if you don't remember, are not a heavily featured species up front in Star Wars, but they have been shown in some of the other films. There was a Klatooinian on Jabba's sail barge, if I remember right, in Return of the Jedi, and also there was one on the Jedi Council as well, named Tarados Gon, who actually fought alongside the other Jedi at Geonosis, and so he's featured there in Attack of the Clones. But they're a race that sort of looks kind of like orcs or Uruk-hai from the Lord of the Rings. They're very like orcish. Anyway, they were raiding this village. Cut to the Mandalorian landing on this planet with the yodeling in tow, and they're going to try to investigate how to lay low here. He gets off of his ship. He tells the child to stay put. That obviously isn't going to happen. He's right there as soon as the Mando opens the door, the cargo bay door to his ship, the Razor Claw. Is that right? Razor Crest. Keep getting that wrong. The Razor Crest. So he's like, fine, you're coming with me. So they go into town and they find this little, well, it's not really a tavern. It's more kind of just like a local restaurant, diner kind of place. And there's kind of a cool little bit in there where when they walk in, down underneath the table, one of the people in there has a loth cat. And if you don't know about that, they're sort of a species of creature that was featured in the Rebels show. And it kind of goes after the little yodeling in one little bit there. So it's just kind of cool to see the loth cat there. And The Mando goes in there to try to get some food and beverage, and he sees across the room, or he ends up in this place having an encounter with this new character called Cara Dune, who we find out is a. She's kind of wearing this beat up armor. She looks. He thinks she might be a bounty hunter. He's, cautious for himself and the child. And they end up having an encounter with each other. He tracks her. He shows that he has thermal tracking technology as part of his arsenal. You get to see that in action, and then he tracks her down. They have a big fight with each other, and that's kind of an interesting little scene. And then after they have their fight, they're able to sit down and have a conversation when he finds out that she's not after him or the child. She's not tracking a bounty or anything. He finds out that she's actually she used to be a shock trooper, and then she defected and helped the rebellion sort of as a rebel supporting mercenary to clean up imperial enclaves and stuff like that after the Battle of Endor. And so, yeah, she's just spent a bunch of time rooting out Imperials and doing that sort of work for the rebellion and the seeds of the New Republic. So she doesn't have any interest in taking them down, and they have a kind of a conversation with each other about it and get to know each other more. And Mando decides, oh, I guess I'm going to leave this planet because this person's here and she doesn't want me to be here. Because they're both kind of wanted people. She's trying to settle down in retirement. They don't want to cause trouble for each other, so he's getting ready to leave, and he gets approached by two of the villagers from the village at the beginning of the episode, and they are desperate to save their village from the invaders because they tell him, their grandparents originally seeded those pawns, and they don't want to leave it. They don't want to abandon it. They have a tradition and a history there. So he decides to, what the heck, to go help him out, and brings Cara Dune with him. And they go to this village, and when they're there, they meet the woman from the beginning of the episode. Her name is Omira, and her daughter Winta. And Omira is very kind. She sort of puts him up in her house and, feeds Cara and the Mandalorian, and they get to know each other. The child gets on well with the rest of the children in this village, so there's a lot of cute scenes of the yodeling wandering around. He does the thing where he puts a frog in his mouth, but this time he spits it out, and they really, the kids in the village really embrace the little baby Yoda. And the Mando is kind of getting to know Omira, and she asks him about his helmet and where he came from and stuff, if he's ever taken it off in front of people. And he says no, not since he was a young boy did he ever take it off in front of anybody. And then he tells her a little bit more about his backstory, and we find out from what he tells her that apparently he's not actually a Mandalorian, but he was adopted by Mandalorians after his family was taken out by the separatist invasion of his home planet. So that leads me to believe that maybe in those flashbacks, the planet in question that's being invaded is not a Mandalorian home planet or anything like that. It's some separate planet with separate peoples on it that gets invaded, and then it's random Mandalorian tribes people that eventually rescue and adopt this kid, I guess. We don't know a lot about where that's going, and I really hope they fill that in. But so, they get to know each other, we find out stuff, and then the people in the village say, please help us stay where we are. We're getting invaded by these people, this tribe or whatever, bandits, and Cara and the Mandalorian at least agree to track them and see what they're up against. When they do their tracking, they find out that this band of raiders has a full functioning AT-ST at their disposal, one of the big chicken walkers from Return of the Jedi. And they go back to the village, and Cara says, look, the two of us and a bunch of farmer people are not equipped at all to deal with an AT-ST. You're better off just leaving. So my advice to you would just be to abandon your village and go somewhere else. And they insist. They say, we can't leave. we insist on staying here. And so the Mandalorian and Kara decide to train them as best they can and come up with a plan to potentially try to take down the AT-ST. They dig a bunch of holes, and then they concoct this plan. They train everybody how to shoot and stuff like that, and give them primitive stick weapons and things, and they concoct this plan to dig these trenches so that they'll attract the AT-ST to come out of the woods during the night. So they go over and raid the village, and they use these thermal detonators to draw out the Klatooinians and the AT-ST back over to the village, and then they lure the AT-ST over to this trench trap where it makes a misstep and falls over, and the Mando is able to throw a thermal detonator inside of the cockpit and blow it up. And so they're, the village is saved and all that stuff. There's some interesting stuff while they're training. Omira, I don't know if we'll ever find out more about her backstory, but they ask anybody if anybody there is familiar with, has any skill with shooting whatsoever, and she raises her hand. She's the only person, a native in this village, that raises her hand and says she is, and then they demonstrate the use of weapons and everybody's learning it, and she's a crack shot. So she at least has some interesting backstory compared to some of these other villagers. She obviously hasn't always been a rural farmer. I guess we could assume that. Anyway, the day is saved after all, and peace comes back to this village. The Mandalorian is getting pretty cozy, but decides he feels like in order to best help the child, the yodeling, that he feels like he might be endangering it, that he might be a risk to it, and to best protect it, he thinks he should leave it at this village. So he tells Omira, I'm going to leave the child with you, I'm going to leave it in this village, it'll be safer here, and I'm going to move on, and that'll be best for everybody. And while all this scene is happening, there's a bounty hunter that's tracking the yodeling, a sniper in the woods, and he's got a bead on the yodeling, and he's about to take his shot, and then Cara Dune tracks the bounty hunter from behind and shoots him in the chest and takes him out. And then there's another one of those beepy trackers that they find, that this bounty hunter is tracking the child still. And so when the Mando discovers that, he decides to take the child and move on and bid Cara Dune and Omira and the villagers and everybody goodbye, and they hop on their ship and go off to some other place again. And that's more or less what happens in the episode. There's not a lot of plot development, but there's a lot of interesting, it's a nice, interesting, encapsulated episode. And we do get the introduction of Cara Dune, who's a new character, and I think we may see more of her, although I'm not sure how or where or when. Now, I mentioned before that I feel like this is kind of the weakest episode so far, and it's not because it's a good self-contained episode, which is why I think Bryce Dallas Howard did a good job of directing the episode. I think from a flow and a writing perspective of the overall arc of the show, for me, I'm hoping to see a little bit more meta-narrative, a little bit more meta-development with the backstory of the Mandalorian, the backstory of the child, how this all fits into galactic history, that sort of thing. I'm hoping that this doesn't end up just being Mandalorian and child go to a different place every week, and here's what happens this time. I don't think that's what's going to happen, but that's what this episode kind of felt like. And I wanted a little bit more developed. We got a little bit. They inch you forward with things. Like, we got a little bit more with the Mandalorian. We learned out, I think maybe he's adopted, it seems like. He's not actually a Mandalorian, but an adopted Mandalorian. But we need a lot more, in my opinion. I need a lot more about Mandalorian culture and about the backstory of this particular character. We're halfway through. I think it's supposed to be an 8-episode run, and that was episode 4. So we're halfway through the first season. And I feel like whenever you have these scripted shows on these streaming services, this is usually the point in the series where you'll get like a whole episode that's just like a flashback episode, and I don't always like that. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I feel like personally it might be really appropriate here if we just had um, where did the Mando come from episode. That's just sort of like a total flashback episode. If that's not forthcoming in the next episode, like in the next two episodes, I'd be surprised. I feel like this series kind of needs that. That's at least that's what I'm wanting, because there are all these mysteries, about, what is the Yoda species, and all of these questions that you have if you're a Star Wars, if you know anything about Star Wars heading into this show. And if they just keep making it the adventures of the Mandalorian protecting this kid on a new planet every week, then it's entertaining and very well made and very well acted and directed, but it's I don't like I need a little bit more than that personally. So I wasn't unhappy with what we got in this per se, as an individual episode, and it's hard for me to knock it for not having, overall meta narrative or something like that. I think it just has to do with placement, where it's like at this point in the show, 4 episodes into an 8 episode arc, I feel like we should be getting a little bit more than we're getting, with these 28 to 30 minute episodes, that are advancing character, reveals very, very slowly, and plot reveals hardly at all. Uh, that's kind of where I'm at with it right now. I mean, obviously, we're only halfway through, so a lot can happen in 4 episodes, and I'm still highly optimistic. I'm totally on board for this show. I think it's really good. Um, I'm interested to see what happens next, but that's kind of where my mind is at with it right now. I want to see what happens. Also, this episode, the plot of this episode, I've talked a lot about the Western influences and the Japanese film influences of this, and if you are familiar at all with the Seven Samurai, Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, or The Magnificent Seven, which is based on Seven Samurai, uh, the plot of this episode is straight up that. It's just the plot of Seven Samurai, where you have a village that's being raided, and then a bunch of mercenary good do-gooders come into town and help make a defensive stand and save the village. It is exactly that. So, while I do think that one of the reasons why this show has been successful so far and has been appealing is because it does tap into those Western and Japanese film tropes, and those are the foundational roots of Star Wars in general. When George Lucas made A New Hope, the original Star Wars, he was highly inspired by Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress, as well as westerns and serials from the 30s and 40s, and that is sort of hard baked into the DNA of what Star Wars is, and the choice to sort of give those things an homage, in this show, I think, is one of the reasons why it's been resonating with me and other people so far, is because Favreau and the other people that are making this show understand that those tropes and styles are sort of in the special sauce, the DNA of what makes Star Wars Star Wars. So that's really good. However, if you this particular episode adheres pretty strictly to, it's a little bit more than an homage. It really just is the plot of Seven Samurai. So, take that for what it is. That's not a huge. It's not necessarily a huge knock stylistically, but from a storytelling and plot point of view, to me, this is a little bit of for the most part, a really good but ultimately a throwaway episode from a plot perspective. From a plot perspective, from a character perspective, it's not a throwaway episode at all, because we get new chunks and nuggets of the backstories of things, but we haven't had any advancement on anything about the yodeling. We haven't had anything about why that creature was a bounty and what they were trying to do. I mean, there's a lot of mysteries already set up in the first 4 episodes of this, and if this is episode 4 of 8, I feel like at the very least in the next episode we should be hitting a climax and getting some resolution for the end of the first season. Of course, there will be a cliffhanger. There's going to be a second season, but we should be. I'm hoping to for the first episode to have or first season to at least have a satisfying arc, even if there is a cliffhanger. So I'm optimistic about it. Those are kind of my general thoughts. I hope that wasn't too scattery or rambly. But that's where I'm at with episode 4, Sanctuary. If you have any other thoughts or things I didn't mention, things you might have noticed, let me know down below. If you think this episode was a lot stronger than I did, or if it's been your favorite of the batch, I'd like to know why. That would be cool to talk about below. Thanks for commenting, liking, and subscribing. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this and check it out. I'll be back next week on, let me check my calendar, the 6th, Friday the 6th, when they release episode 5 and all the rest of the Disney original content. And until then, I hope you have a really excellent day. I hope there's a little bit of magic in it, and thanks for watching. See you then.